It's Thursday, the 1st of December. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Nikki Aitken, Liberal Democrat MP Helen Morgan, the Daily Mirror's Fleet Street Fox Susie Boniface and the cancer specialist Professor Carol Sikora. Today,
this is a whole system failure. It's just really traumatic for her, and to see a family member like that, it's just horrid.
It's not right, it's not acceptable. I'm not blaming them, it just needs to be fixed, it needs to be sorted.
40-hour waits for ambulances, 7 million on waiting lists. How can the NHS be fixed? Protests continue in China over lockdowns. Can the country escape its zero COVID policy?
It is their responsibility to make sure that when it comes to misinformation, when it comes to the hate that we're seeing, that they take action.
Twitter's owner Elon Musk relaxes rules over misinformation. Is the social network safe in his hands? More on that later on, but let's start with this story in The Times. Buyers could need planning consent for a holiday home. Being reported that ministers will make it harder for new properties to be turned into holiday homes under plans to see off a Tory rebellion on planning rules. We've talked a lot this week on Politics Live about those mandatory housing targets and the rebellion on them. But the question on this... could this help solve the housing crisis, Nikki?
Well, I know Michael Gove's listening very much to my colleagues who have got constituencies in tourist areas, and it's a massive issue, this. We don't want to ban people from having holiday homes because, you know, tourism is a really important part of the local economy, but we need public sector workers in particular to be able to afford to live in these areas. In my own constituency here in the cities of London and Westminster, I've got 13,000 Airbnb properties alone in Westminster, and that comes with a whole host of issues. So I'm really supportive of tightening up, but obviously not. It's a balance, as always. Right,
Helen, are you in favour of this? Do you think it could actually do something to help solve the housing shortage?
Yes, I think we'd probably even go further. I think if you look at tourist areas, they need some holiday homes in order to bring those tourists into their region. But clearly, if there's so many that people can't afford to live there and work in the industry and provide public services, then that's a problem for that area.
Well, you say you'd like to go further. How?
I think we'd like to give planning control to local authorities to say how many holiday homes, second homes and first homes that they would have, so that we can get those balances right in those areas where housing is under so much pressure.
So you'd like to see numbers actually regulated. What do you think, Susie, about this idea? I mean, you know, are you in favour of it? But will it actually go anyway to solving the housing problem?
Well, there are two different kinds of holiday homes, and one of the biggest problems we've got, I think, is people who have second homes, which are occupied on average for about 2 weeks a year. That makes it the most expensive holiday you'd ever take, and it also hollows out towns and villages up and down the length of the country. It removes funding from schools, it removes funding from local hospitals, it removes people from the local economy, and when someone only comes along for 2 weeks of the year, it does nothing for.
So would you like them banned?
I would like owning a second home absolutely taxed out of existence, because it serves no useful purpose. It's merely an investment vehicle for people who've got lots of money to spend.
Carol Sikora?
I walked a delightful holiday on the Pembrokeshire coast path, and you could see the problem. Social deprivation, no jobs, people can't afford accommodation, so there's no one serving in the bars, no one serving you dinner, because they just can't get staff, because they can't afford to live in that part of the world because of holiday homes. So some controls are necessary, I think.
Well, some controls from you. I mean, Nikki, what about Susie's suggestion, taxed out of existence?
I don't think any extreme type of policy really ever works, and it's about a balance, as I said. It's about ensuring that local people can afford to live in, particularly in the areas that they were brought up in and have been born and brought up in, and they can, support their older family members. But again, as we've heard, that these tourist areas do rely on tourists, and so we need to, again, there's no policy that's going to resolve the issue unless we allow local authorities more say.
Right.
as Helen said.
But you know, your colleague Theresa Villiers, Conservative MP, was sitting in that chair yesterday. As you know, she is one of dozens of Conservative MPs who want to scrap housing targets altogether, the mandatory housing targets, the homes that this country really needs. Do you agree with her?
I think we do need to build more homes. I think the Prime Minister's been very clear. We have, you know, every government has failed to build more homes, whether it's Labour or Conservative, for generations, and we've got to do it. And there's got to be some compromise. I think I would not want to dictate to local councils what they do with regarding numbers, but there has to be flexibility.
All right. Well, if you wouldn't dictate, would you sign up to the amendment then?
I won't sign up to the amendment because I'm Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party and I can't sign up to things like that.
Right, but you believe in it, do you, though?
I believe that there needs to be more flexibility for local authorities, but we've, at the same time, you know, in London, the average cost of a home in my constituency is £1 million, Joe. That is ridiculous. We need to have more
So if you were
affordable
Deputy
homes.
Chairman of the party, you would sign up to the amendment?
Not necessarily. I think we need to have a much more nuanced debate about it.
Let's have a look at this story, BBC News. Ambulance waits, you heard in the headline, of 40 hours as NHS delays worsen in England. Helen, your response, you've got figures out today as well, the Liberal Democrats, on ambulance delays. What about the difference across the country in different areas?
Well, I think it's been very obvious to anyone in Shropshire for a long time that if you're in a rural area, your ambulance response time is much worse than if you're in an urban area. And some of the average times that we see these ambulance services release mask those big differences. So I did an ambulance shift with my ambulance service a few weeks ago, and I can tell you that none of the Category 2 patients we got to were within 2 hours. There are huge waits outside every hospital, and every ambulance paramedic or anyone involved in the service that you speak to says, our problem here is actually in discharge from the hospital. It's in social care. Our ambulances are queuing up outside hospitals because the hospital is full to the brim and we can't get people out the back door.
Is it acceptable, this postcode lottery?
No, not at all.
Right. I mean, well, the government's been in play for 12 years, various iterations of Conservative governments. Why is it this bad?
Well, the government, I think it's very clear, the NHS has never been so well funded. And, you know, in the autumn statement a couple of weeks ago, the Chancellor announced even more funding, particularly with the post-COVID backlog that we've got. But I think, as Helen said, the issue is we can't get patients out of their beds, and we've got to have a much more joined up working with social care, with local councils and the NHS.
That's what the national insurance increase was supposed to pay for, and it's been stopped by your government. So how are you going to do it?
Not by this government, by the previous Prime
the
Minister.
Conservative Party, let's say, that suggested it. They were going to do it after COVID. That was Boris Johnson's idea, and then after goodness knows what's happened since then and who's in charge now.
I would suggest that the latest Prime Minister, the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, he brought this in. He didn't agree with taking it away, but we had a different Prime Minister at the time, and we voted for it to be taken away. So, you know, I think the current Prime Minister would have had a different view.
Let's just have a look at this headline. Article written by our guest here, Professor Carol Sikora in the Daily Telegraph. Private healthcare can save the NHS, but only if we stop demonising it. If those who can afford it take up the offer, then that frees up space for everybody else in the public system. You know it's a controversial position to take. But would it free up space for everybody?
Could. If you look at the root cause, and you mentioned the root cause just now, it's discharge that's the problem. There's nowhere for people to go. We call them bed blockers. They're not encouraged to do that. That's what it is. They're elderly. They don't want to be in hospital. They want to go somewhere better. A hospital bed costs at least £500, sometimes £700 a night in London, for example. They need to be in nice accommodation. Granny annexes have gone, so the home's not a solution. Care homes won't take people that need nursing care or are ill. So what we have to do is build step-down accommodation. Private sector could do that very quickly. Just as private sector runs care homes, private sector runs council places for people with severe disabled, young people with severe disablement. We can do the same, and we can do it very quickly. It just needs a bit of imagination. The trouble is it falls between the cracks of the care home and the hospital. No one has a budget, no one has control. We need need to find solutions. The paramedics are fantastic, the ambulance service is great. It's not their fault they take 2 hours to go to someone with a heart attack in a rural area. It's just they're stuck on the ramp, and the only way out is to sort out the discharge policy.
In terms of demonising the idea of the private sector being involved, do you agree that that's a problem, Susie?
I think the private sector has been said to be the solution to the NHS's problems for the entirety of my lifetime. And it hasn't yet worked, no matter what's happened. Under Thatcherism, the internal market just created more levels of bureaucracy. Under Labour, PFI just loaded the NHS Trust with unserviceable debt. And then in 2012, the Lansley reforms cost billions and have had to be unpicked. Now, either it's a great idea and it's just being implemented by idiots, and that's the problem, or it's a terrible idea. And unless we can guarantee that the next people who are in charge of the NHS aren't going to be idiots like we've had for the past 40 years, then I think you have to try a different idea.
Well,
it's plainly not worked.
Yeah. I would say it's worth a try. Specific project. Look how opticians work. When I was a kid, I had glasses. I had to go to an NHS optician. It took months to get the glasses. Things have changed now. People advertise appointments the same day to get your eyes on the NHS, funded by the NHS in the private sector.
You can make a profit out of glasses. You can't make a profit out of people who are all eventually going to die anyway.
You can if you build suitable care homes with nursing care that are much cheaper to run, much more pleasant for the patients, and local to where they live.
Well, we used to have something called cottage hospitals,
yeah,
and they all got shut down because it was decided that they were too expensive as a way of... But actually, the benefit of them was not just the fact that respite care they provided and the rehabilitation care they provided after surgery. It was the fact that they did help clear out hospitals. And so, that, you know, when you start looking at the budget and the cash, who goes in and what goes out, suddenly cottage hospitals look ineffective and you know, unnecessary, and so they shut them all down, and this is where we are.
Why do you think it would work, though, Carol Sikora, to actually have or encourage people who could afford to pay for a hip operation or a cataract operation to go and do that, that it would free up space and bring down that waiting list? Why would it do that if you're using the same people effectively, the same doctors and the same staff? That's where I don't understand how it would work.
You create a workforce which would increase gradually, and that's the problem. We don't have the staff. We sort of have the equipment all around the place, and the NHS is really not bad in terms of how it's equipped, but we don't have the staff to staff it 24/7, for example, which you could do, and is done in other countries. The problem, though, if you use the private sector to do people that can afford hip replacements and other procedures that are not hugely expensive, they're not. It's not like a heart transplant or a bone marrow transplant, which costs over £100,000. You can get somewhere, and you can actually reduce waiting lists for those that are on the NHS that can't afford it.
Well, is this an idea that should be embraced, Nikki?
Well, the system at the moment is obviously not working. We can't have the ambulances queuing outside like we are up and down the country at the moment. And you know, the government is putting more money into it. It announced it in the autumn statement. There's Steve Barclay's asked the NHS for the emergency recovery plan for January.
Sure.
But I think that NHS bosses, perhaps we need to get them to start looking at, with a blank piece of paper, what do we need our NHS to look like? How do we provide universal care? But perhaps bringing in private, I don't know. I mean, I think it's fascinating that you're suggesting this. I'm not saying it's the answer, but the current situation is not working, so we do really need to get the NHS bosses to consider what needs to happen to make it better.
I think we already have an element of private provision, though, don't we? I mean, the GP model is a private model, the dentist model is a private model. We've got a huge shortage of GPs, so it's not working to bring the extra people and grow the workforce there. It's failed entirely with dental provision, as far as I can see. And if you look at care homes, the disjointedness of the service is one of the problems that we have in terms of discharging people into care. And all these people are fishing in the same pool for the same staff, and I don't see how privatising an element of it is going to resolve that issue.
No. I think the issue might be resolved if you had something like a national care service that could tie into the NHS, have massive economies of scale, actually be funded properly, and be able to, you know, have handshakes across hospitals and care homes to get people out of hospitals.
The private sector is great at bringing investment money in, provided they can see an income stream at the end of it. And it's safe for the investor, safe for pension funds to invest in that. So it would work. The difficulty is the staff. Would you end up pinching staff to the private sector that could be in the NHS? The problem is the workforce strategy is just not there for healthcare.
Right, and is that a government failure in that sense?
In the long term, yes. Importing nurses, doctors from abroad it's great to let them have training here, but not to keep them forever, which is the strategy from India and Philippines for nurses and from other countries for doctors. You know, we've got to get our own staff. We've got to really make medicine, healthcare an attractive proposition as a career.
But as soon as it has to be profit-making, when there's a change of circumstance, that company can walk away and throw the problem back at the NHS. So we're seeing it with care homes right, left and centre. Their energy bills are so high that they're no longer profitable. And so they're literally just going, oh, we're out, and throwing those patients back at the NHS or the local council without any scope to plan or provide for those people. And so I think there's inherent risk in giving those contracts to the private sector.
Right, I think you can surmount that quite easily by having fallback plans and having investment in the fallback plan from the person providing the step-down care home, for example. It's a way of trying to address the root cause of the real problem. The pictures of the ambulances on ramps are one thing. How do you stop it?
All right, let's go to some of your specific plans. Tell us about your NHS Gold plan. How would that work?
I don't think anyone would like that. It's a sort of plan we talk in the doctor's coffee room. Basically, the idea would be, instead of the money from patients when they go privately going to a private institution, why not have it within the NHS? You know, Barbara Castle threw the private wings out of the NHS in the 60s. Now they're back, but they're not very friendly to private patients. They're very poor at marketing. Can you actually have an NHS Gold plan where people pay something and they get a different level of service, for example? And that profit from that for the NHS goes back into providing an overall better service for poorer people. So that's one mechanism of doing it.
Susie?
I think that's a two-tier NHS, which is the opposite of what the NHS is supposed to be. My father recently had a very small procedure on the NHS and he got put up overnight afterwards in a private rorum because they had no other room in the flipping hospital and they had to use the private
I think it
wings
happens
to do
quite a lot.
It happens a lot. And I just think what we need to do is to have an NHS. We've got to realise that there are some things, if we want our country to have a service, whether it is the trains, whether it is the water, whether it is schools, that we just have to provide it. And that's it, flat. We pay for it. There is not necessarily a profit.
So higher taxes to pay for it.
It is the right taxes spent in the right way.
Right. I mean, what do you think about that system, NHS Gold? The idea that people who pay a little bit, it goes into the NHS rather than specifically to a private scheme or contract.
Well, I agree. I don't think we need a two-tier system in the NHS. It's meant to be about universal offer. And the Scottish Government, the SNP Scottish Government suggested that, I think, last week and got
well, they were
shouted
leaked.
down.
They were leaked reports and they completely distanced themselves and rejected the idea that it would be a case of a sort of NHS Gold. But it certainly looked as if it was discussed. Should we be discussing these things? Or is it, as Carol Sikora suggests, that it's so demonised that people can't even talk about these things openly?
I think a two-tier system should be rejected out of hand. I think we can discuss how we deliver universal care in a better and more effective way. We need to have that discussion because the NHS is in a state of crisis, but I don't think we should be entertaining options that literally differentiate you by your bank balance.
Right, well, let's have a look at this graph because it shows very starkly people waiting for hospital treatment in England. More than 1 year, 18 weeks to 1 year and up to 18 weeks, but 7 million. How do you tackle it?
Well, I think there's a clear problem with lack of staff. I mean, if we look at places like Shropshire, which have a particular problem because they're rural and attracting those staff is even more difficult. We don't have, for example, timely radiology. You can wait several months for a radiology appointment, not because they can't afford one, but because they haven't got a radiologist. So for me, the staffing issue is the key issue.
All right, so staffing is critical, but is this recoverable from, Nikki? I mean, it just feels incredible. 7 million people.
It's got to be recoverable. And,
Right.
and that's why the Health Secretary has made it very clear to the NHS that he expects the emergency recovery plan to be on his desk by January. I think, again, this is an awful lot to do with the knock-on effects from the pandemic. Not solely, but
This
also...
started before the
It did, but
pandemic.
also, Jo, I think it goes
did.
back to the point I made at the very beginning. We've got to sort out social care, and we've also got to sort out council funding for social care and not just always give the money to the NHS. The NHS has got to give money to local councils to be able to support people older people coming out of hospital. And we know that we are a growing older population.
Why has
This
the
is not
NHS
going-
got to
this-
fund that? Because traditionally that's the government funds
because the
local
NHS
authorities
does,
for care.
The NHS is given the money. It is the NHS and social care.
But the NHS has
department.
never funded that. It's always been central government funds local care, local authorities provide care. And what you're suggesting is now the NHS lose some of its current
that's not
budget
right.
to go to local...
From my time when I was leader of Westminster Council, we worked very closely with our local NHS and often pooled resources. There's a great a nursing care home just around the corner from here, which does exactly what you say. They take the patients from the hospitals and they give them the care they need. Maybe they might move back home, they might go to a care home. And it's about the NHS and local authorities working together, because unless we sort out social care...
is different to what you
it's
said, which was money going from the NHS budget.
Not from the primary care health. It's about primary care. This is what we're talking about. We've got to ensure that the NHS works with local authorities to ensure that primary care is properly funded. And I think local councils can do more in primary care, working with GPs, working with health workers.
Do you think it's recoverable from, Carol Sikora?
It is recoverable, but I think we have to look at all options. I mean, you sort of imply that we can't talk about NHS Gold. Let's talk about everything, every single possibility of how we can do it, including sending patients abroad, including importing doctors, including contracting radiology to Australia, for example, which is perfectly technically feasible now, to the interpretation of X-rays. So let's talk about everything. Just sort of ban discussion because it's no longer universal, it's differential care, it's two-tier. Let's work out how we can make it acceptable in a different format.
But can you understand people's concerns?
I do.
That it would look like queue jumping, that we've talked about a two-tier system, that you would lose the universal sense, the sort of core principle of the NHS? Or is this such an emergency that, as you say, everything's got to be thrown up in the air?
These 7 million people, some of them, probably 20%, will end up going private and paying it for themselves, I suspect. And that's totally unfair because everyone's paid their taxes, so why shouldn't they all be able to do that? Well, they can't because they have different financial circumstances. So let's discuss everything.
Do you think that's fair to look at these things, Susie?
There's nothing wrong with working out the best way to go forward and discussing everything. I don't think anyone's suggesting banning discussing it. But what I think we need to talk about is the practicalities. If there is a doctor, and let's say it's Carol, and you have an NHS cancer patient, and you have a clinic, and you have to have so many through in a day, and those clinics always overrun, and it always gets stressful, but you've got maybe 10, 15 minutes maximum to talk to those patients. If you then, on the top of that, have to go and see some private patients in the private wing who are going to expect far more of your time, then that is a massive differentiation in care. And it's one person, it's one doctor doing all that.
Yeah, it already happens. I mean, if you look at how the NHS works everywhere, an orthopaedic surgeon, even in Shropshire, away from London, has got a thriving private practice almost certainly, and they're doing exactly, they're trying to juggle their time. What we need to do is to think of all sorts of ideas that explore the boundaries and forget about the politics until we come up with a solution.
Let's have a look at this. BBC News story, China signals ease in COVID policy after mass protests. You will have seen over the past few weeks a huge, significant level of protests across a number of Chinese cities. Showing you here pictures in Shanghai, filmed by the BBC. Lots of members of the public unusually confronting the authorities, and some appear to be manhandled. Also, as far as China is concerned, despite the fact that they have a reputation for putting down these kinds of protests, this headline, signalling an ease in the COVID policy, shows that they're obviously thinking about lockdowns and the way they've handled them. Carol Sikora, why has it been so difficult for China to deal with coronavirus?
I guess it's where it arose, and the social structure is very different from what we're used to, and the power of the state is much greater, and the state overreacted, and now we have the consequence. They can't back down easily. It's a problem everywhere how we get out of COVID. It's a problem here for many people. They're still frightened, and we've all got to get out of it somehow. Zero
COVID policy, an achievable objective?
No, it never was from the beginning. And I think that's their problem. But they can't backtrack. The politicians can't backtrack. And the politicians are a one-party state, so they really can't say we'd got it completely wrong. Here, there's much more freedom of discussion about the COVID inquiry and so on, but not there.
Watching these protests, Susie, and looking at them, I mean, people really fighting back in terms of being locked up in their homes and in accommodation there in China. Could you imagine another lockdown here?
I think the lockdowns we've had here and the lockdowns they have in China are massive, two hugely different things. They're done for different reasons and they're done in different ways. I think the lockdowns that are there, as Carol says, they're to do with the repression of the state. It's because they were trying to go for a zero COVID policy right at the start when the disease appeared, and they can't reverse that particular ferret. Whereas here, if we hadn't had the lockdowns that we had, we would have had something far worse. We would have had an NHS that really did collapse. We would have had bodies piling up in the streets, perhaps. And it would have got a lot worse. So while there were costs and impacts to the lockdowns, not all of them brilliant by any means, I think the alternative would have been far, far worse.
Would it have been far, far worse, the alternative?
We don't know. That's the problem.
True. We'll never know the counterfactual.
We'll never know the truth.
But what was your view about lockdowns here?
COVID became top priority at the expense of things like cancer and heart disease, and I think that was the mistake. We should have protected those diseases that can't wait. Hip replacement, that can wait 6 months, no problem, but cancer needs to be treated. People were stopped in the midst of chemotherapy, for example. I remember that, and that is crazy to do that.
I mean, the Lib Dems were quite keen on lockdowns. Your colleague Layla Moran was on this programme a number of times talking about a more zero COVID policy. Was she wrong?
I think with the benefit of hindsight, we can see that if you keep people locked down for too long a period of time in a free society, it's not going to be successful. They won't accept that. But I think we need to acknowledge that the impact of the lockdowns or the impact of easing up after those lockdowns have left people suffering with long COVID. There are consequences to having a high level of COVID in society. And, you know, it's difficult. We have hindsight now, which we didn't have at the time. I mean, my personal view is that we had a very chaotic situation before the vaccine where lockdowns were probably needed earlier. They probably would have been shorter if we'd locked down earlier. We had that chaotic situation over Christmas 2020 where we sent the kids back to school for a day and then hundreds of thousands of people contracted COVID and tens of thousands of people died. I think it's difficult to argue that we should have had looser restrictions then, but there's no doubt that post-vaccine we are in a better place and that we are having to live with the consequences of people missing out on cancer treatment, for example. And that's a terrible choice that we were faced with. And it's easy with hindsight, I think, to go back and criticise what happened. We need to remember the situation that we were in at the time.
I mean, hindsight is, as they say, a wonderful thing. Has it changed your mind or views towards COVID lockdowns? Could you ever imagine one coming back here?
I can't particularly, no, I don't. And I think what we've learnt, and compared to what China's going through now, is that immunisation is the way forward. And I'm very proud that the vaccination programme, was such a success, and it allowed us to come out of lockdown. And so I think that's the way forward. And I think China now, I think they announced yesterday they were starting their vaccination programme up again. And I think that's the way forward.
So why has it been dismantled?
Well, so Susie, go straight to the story here in the Eye. UK playing with fire after COVID jabs U-turn warn scientists, and also Kate Bingham, who was the vaccine czar, saying exactly that, questioning whether all the work done on vaccines here, why has it been dismantled? Nikki?
Well, we've got the Health and Security Agency now, which is leading the way. They've got a particular centre now within the agency on dedicated pandemic planning, and I believe vaccinations are part of that.
Well, I mean, Susie, does that reassure you?
No, because Kate Bingham, who was the genius who managed to sort all this out, says exactly the opposite. UKHSA is just Public Health England rebranded and rebadged. It's got a few extra things, but the vaccine centres that we wanted to build and design have got sold off to some American companies. And the actual infrastructure that you need to roll out another vaccine if there's another pandemic just isn't there anymore, Kate says. And because of what happened, we all became virology experts inadvertently. Some of us might have been already, but we kept during the pandemic. And they also that there's going to be another pandemic quite soon.
Well, what?
I think the trouble is there's all sorts of things out there. Accidents, major accident drills and so on for train crashes, nuclear warfare drills and so on. sort of policies for infectious disease, they have to be in place, but you don't want to continue spending a lot of money on them. You just have to have them there so they can be reactivated. So I think the strategy now is completely correct.
Right, so you don't think there needs to be more done in terms of preparedness for, let's hope not, the next pandemic?
Well, it may not even be COVID, it may be Ebola, or it may be Lassa fever or something. And so you just have to have policies in place. But of course, turkeys don't call for Christmas, and that's why people that are involved in virology are not going to say, oh, we've got to dismantle everything. They're going to say, let's carry on. It's ridiculous not moving forward.
Well, let's stick... Oh, yes, go on, Helen.
But I think it's very important that you learn the lessons. Now we do have hindsight, and it's critical that those lessons are learned. And what Kate Bingham is saying is that those lessons haven't been learned. I think we should be listening to her because she's the one person who seems to have operated competently throughout the whole pandemic and delivered the objective that she was charged with delivering.
Yeah, but she's a victim of her own success in a way. Because they could do it from a standing start so quickly, the idea perhaps within the institutions, the establishment, is we can do that again. We'll just start off from scratch if we need to do it again. You know, and they did the same thing with the Spitfires during the Second World War. We'll just build some more planes when we need one. You know, it would be much more sensible to have something ready to go. And I don't agree that having the vaccine infrastructure there would mean that we weren't using it for something else. I think we'd be developing new vaccines for more things all the time if we had that infrastructure there, and it would benefit us all in the long run.
Let's stick with COVID. Hope Kate Bingham's watching the programme. Lots of praise for you. BBC News Twitter ends COVID misinformation policy under Musk. Let's talk to our disinformation correspondent Mariana Spring. She joins us from our London newsroom. What's happened exactly, Mariana?
Essentially, Musk has dropped quite quietly Twitter's policy that involved labelling or removing misleading and harmful misinformation about COVID-19. And I think to lots of people it might feel like, oh, well, COVID's not as much of a problem here anymore, so why does this matter? Well, firstly, there's a lot of COVID misinformation that continues to spread across social media, including about the vaccines, for example, false or misleading claims that people who've been injured or died were actually injured by the vaccine, even when the evidence is to the contrary and the people affected are saying, no, it wasn't the vaccine. And it's not just that. COVID misinformation can also be a gateway to more extreme conspiracy theories and disinformation. A recent investigation I did for BBC Panorama that looked at how people here in the UK believe, for example, that UK terror attacks didn't happen or that those affected were lying about their injuries. A survey we did as part of that showed that people who believed pandemic disinformation were more likely to believe that more extreme disinformation about everything else being staged or faked. And I think this is part of, or this indicates further, Musk's approach to topics like disinformation and trolling. He's recently also announced that suspended accounts, some that had been removed from the platform for promoting disinformation and also for promoting hate, are allowed to come back. And I've had lots of people in touch with me about troll accounts, for example, that have returned to the platform and started getting back in touch with them. So it raises serious issues about his approach to disinformation, and then also when it comes to employees that he has sacked who worked on this issue, how Twitter will be able to enforce any kind of misinformation or hate policies if they decide to keep them in the months to come.
Can you just comment on the Financial Times story that the EU and US regulators are turning up the heat on Elon Musk over Twitter? What are they doing exactly?
The EU in particular, but also over in the States, are very worried about the possible rise of disinformation and hate on the platform because of these changes, both in terms of losing staff who worked on these areas and changes to policy. And in the EU in particular, they have rules about social media companies having to tackle disinformation. That's not just about the pandemic, it's also about, for example, the war happening right now in Ukraine. We've seen a lot of disinformation, often tied up with the violence on the ground, and the EU is particularly worried that Twitter is no longer going to honour commitments it has to tackling disinformation in EU countries.
Mariana Spring, thank you very much. Let's get reaction from the panel. Nikki, good move by Elon Musk to relax quietly, as Mariana said, COVID misinformation policy?
Not at all. I don't understand why he would do that. I'd like to know his reasoning behind it, and I think it's a real misstep. I'm interested to see what the US and the EU are doing. we've obviously got the online safety bill coming back to the Commons next week, I think it is, and that is a landmark piece of legislation on safety and,
yes,
and misinformation.
although lots of concern amongst some of your colleagues, many of them actually, about free speech.
But I think that's. I think Michelle Donlan, the Culture Secretary, has been listening to that, and I think the amendments that we've been talking about are going through now. And I think she accepts it. I think the big thing for her, having had conversations with her, is about the under-18s and making sure that children are particularly safeguarded online.
Do you have any sympathy at all with what Elon Musk has done on Twitter in terms of free speech, opening up platforms, or is this a completely risky, reckless strategy?
I think there's no alternative. Who's going to be the arbiter? And that's the whole problem. Who's the judge in this? It's so difficult. I gave a university lecture in 2020 in June on cancer and COVID, and it was put on Facebook, as all the lectures are at the college, and it was taken down by Facebook because it was supposed to be misinformation about COVID. A letter or two from a few people, and it was put back up 24 hours later. But who makes these decisions? The computer can look for hate words, they can look for swear words, obviously, but it can't look for a value judgment about COVID, and that's Musk's problem with Twitter. I suspect it's a gimmick to get some attention for Twitter, but who knows what he's doing.
I mean, how would you regulate then for that sort of situation that Carol Sikora described?
Well, you need to have a value judgment, you need to have a human being to make that value judgment. Yeah. And of course, Elon Musk has sacked a huge amount of his workforce, and the rest he hasn't sacked have actually walked out. Now, 90% of Twitter's income comes from advertising revenue, and no corporation will advertise with a business that they feel is going to damage their brand in some way. And that means it has to be perhaps freedom of speech, but it has to have some regulation. It has to have some moderation.
But how do you regulate? Who makes that judgment call? Who says that goes over the line? And who says, well, this is just open debate?
Well, ultimately, for all businesses, it's the advertisers. And that's, Elon Musk doesn't own Twitter. Debt owns Twitter, and it's the banks that own the debt. They haven't sold that debt on because at the moment they wouldn't get a very good price for it because he's destroying the product. He is going to have to start having moderation in order to protect the value of that product, or the banks are going to remove him.
Right. Is Twitter now in danger of being over-regulated by the EU and the US, in the way we've just heard?
I really don't think it is. I think having an individual billionaire in control of essentially what constitutes free speech in a massive marketplace is really dangerous. And I think that's why we would have liked to have seen the online safety bill come through sooner and address some of these issues sooner. Now, we know they're difficult. We do have to balance free speech with protecting people from harm. But we've seen from, the insurrection in the US on the Capitol building, that was largely driven by people who buy these conspiracy theories online. And they have real life implications when people lose their trust in politicians because of a stream of misinformation or disinformation. And therefore, it's important that we bring the online safety bill forward and get those regulations right.
Would you be concerned, though, that Carol Sikora's speech was taken down initially?
Yeah, absolutely, of course.
Right.
Ridiculous. But then there are things on Facebook.
But it went back up.
It went back up.
But there's still anti-Semitism all over Facebook, all over Twitter. I know, because I'm showing it all the time, and that doesn't get taken off. And that's why I hope the online safety bill will help with that.
Just fine. Would you be comfortable, though, Carol, with someone with lots of followers tweeting disinformation about vaccine, encouraging people not to take one?
I think the buyer has to beware the product, and those that read have to know that just as on Google, if you look up cancer on Google, there's over 1 billion sites you can go to, and a lot of it's complete rubbish, and people have to be smart if they're going to use Google about anything. And to censor it is very difficult. Sure, you can take out the swear words, you can take out any hate references, the computer can do that, but this is a value judgment, as you said.
A little bit of breaking news. Ian Blackford, the SNP's leader at Westminster, is to stand down as their leader. And there's been a tribute from Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, as you would expect. I think it's about 5 years or so that he's led the SNP there. So we will obviously bring the news when they have a new leader at Westminster. Let's finish off with this in the Daily Mirror. Plan to ban MPs from going on reality TV after Matt Hancock's I'm a Celebrity stint. This was a Lib Dem policy, a story about your I love it, actually, Bush-Tucker bill. Why?
Well, I think there's a serious point behind all of this, is that when an MP is in Parliament, when Parliament is in session, and they're there to do two jobs. One is to look after their constituents and help them with...
So he's not a Conservative MP anymore, he's now an independent.
And should he get the whip back?
No.
No. What did you think? Did you watch any of it?
I did see some of it, yeah. And I think he probably he was like a black hole of attention on that programme. He just sort of sucked everything towards himself. This enormous gravity well of Matt Hancock's
didn't he?
He did do remarkably well. I think it's because he's got a complete lack of self-doubt, which meant he just threw himself into all the trials. But I would take some exception to talk about whether or not they're allowed to do it on recess, because Parliament's in recess about 6 months of the year, and during that time you will do lots of other work. So I think being on recess doesn't mean that you can just go off and do those things. I think most people in the general public have got an issue with MPs having second jobs, per se.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm self-employed. I've got 1,000 different jobs. But if I was sat here getting paid to sit here and talk, I couldn't at the same time be writing a column for the Mirror over here and ignoring you, going, I'm busy now, because I would never get employed again. No other job in the world gets to do something else at the same time they're being paid to do the main job.
If we stick with Matt Hancock in the jungle, what do you think about this idea of a Bush-Tucker bill?
It seems a bit ridiculous. There's enough employment law. If you, Joe, or I took a month off for no reason to do something, someone would say, without any permission, when we had to do a job, we'd be fired. And so why not an MP?
Because an MP isn't employed, and that's why we need special rules, because we're elected. No one can get rid of us other than our electorate. And that's why we need some rules about how we behave when we're in Parliament or when we're doing our job, because if we can't regulate ourselves, there's no one else to do it.
But then you talk about a stronger power of recall, whereas if there was enough constituents in Matt Hancock's constituency who would vote to recall him and call a by-election, then maybe he'd think twice about going into there in the first place.
I mean, Nikki, you said he shouldn't get the whip back. Are you saying that he shouldn't get the whip back at all before the next election?
Well, I'm not the chief whip, so I don't know. But, you know, when Nadine Dorries did it, she lost it for 6 months. And I think that was a good punishment. I will leave it up to the chief whip to decide what he wants to do. But you're the Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party. I mean, do you think he should get the whip back at all, ever, before the next election? Or should he just stand down? You've got to make a decision. Well, I'm not going to make a decision for him, but we've all been asked to tell the Central Office by a Monday whether we want to stand again, and I don't know what Matt has decided to do.
Would you rather
I would suggest that perhaps, having seen what he's done in the jungle, that he may be thinking about not coming back after the next general election.
Oh, right. So you wouldn't miss him in that sense. I mean, what do you think? Do you think he should stand down? Certainly not be given the whip back by the Conservative Party?
I mean, I don't think his own local party is very keen for him to stand again.
He says he wants to. He says he wants to come back and deal with his constituents.
Well, it's not up to him.
It's not up to him, though, is it? Because he's actually, you know, selected by his local party. So I think we'll see what they say. They don't seem very impressed, based on what I've read in the press.
I mean, it is interesting, though, that on Monday they will have to decide, Conservative MPs, as to whether they are going to stand. Some of them have already said that they won't. Do you think he raised the profile, though, of issues that were important to him, like dyslexia, showed his human side?
No, he mentioned dyslexia twice, and then
third
time in the exit interview. And one of those was only to mention that he couldn't do an anagram because the words were already scrambled up in his head. I don't think that raised awareness for anybody. We already knew that about dyslexia. And what he did do is that by making sure that he had the whip removed, that when he brings his private member's bill tomorrow to Parliament, he's got less and less chance of actually getting that on the statute book. So he's let people with dyslexia down.
All right, that's all we have time for today. Thank you to all of my guests for the programme, and I will be back with Politics UK tomorrow at 12:15 on BBC Two and on BBC iPlayer. Bye-bye.